the pale blue dot.
G'day mates, welcome back to another episode of the My Mate podcast here. I have upgraded my shit. So if you're listening to this, check it out on YouTube. I've got a mad 1080p webcam now with 60 frames per second. I think I've said that right. So it looks a little bit more, up to speed with the other podcasts out there. I've got my Rode mic here, which is killing life, and my computer here is on a stack of Donna Hay old magazines, which I'd never heard of before I started using them for my video content. So that's me, and I'm pumped. Today's episode of the podcast is a shorter one, and it is just me talking. I'm going to read a blog that I wrote, which is an excerpt from my second book, A Seeker's Path. And I've actually divided that book into a third book, which at this stage is going to be called A Chimp Walks Into a Bar, which is all about trauma and addiction. So, my first book was a lot about my own experiences and what I'd learned. And then the second and third book is kind of applying the knowledge that I've gained from studying the mind, studying trauma and addiction, studying fear disorders, and then putting that into a simple, easy to read book, I hope, with a bit of fun in there, because you can't hide your own personality, not to say that I'm fun, but putting all that in there as well to try to now add value. So it's not just about my own personal experiences, which I hope is valuable as well for those that have read it, but also actually applying some of my knowledge and research, because I have, as you know now, if you have been listening to the show, officially started MindMate Counselling, which is a counselling business, and it's to connect with some of you that listen to the show, but connect with other people that don't, that are stuck in life, and hopefully I can help you there. So that's really exciting. And I guess the areas that we talk a lot about on this show are kind of the areas that I'm fascinated with within my own counseling practice. So, it's existential therapy. It's looking at how to find meaning and purpose in your life. Ways to actually get out of bed and feel like you have a reason to do that. It's fear-based disorders. Obviously I'm very, very passionate about fear-based disorders, OCD, panic attacks, the phobias, because I experienced that, in my past, and, they always say clinically you don't want to bring too much of your own self into it, but I can't help that, and I'm that was who I am, and that's why I'm passionate about trying to help people in those areas as well. And then, a new part of this is trauma and addiction, studying the mind, studying the root causes and the ways we kind of begin to manifest certain aspects of our psyche, because we are all things good and bad, and how we get stuck in addictions and habitual negative thinking patterns. And I'm fascinated by how trauma disassociates aspects of the mind and makes us do certain things because we were neglected, rejected, traumatized, all these subjective ideas as children and even to adult life. And addiction is a big part of that. Why we continually do these things that we think are going to make us feel better, even when we know that it's not the right thing. And you can look at the end of the spectrum: drug taking, addiction to sex, addiction to gambling, all these things. We know that we're not supposed to be doing them. We know that we don't want to be doing them, but we do them anyway. And why is that? And trauma has a big part to play in that need for external validation, that need to feel whole. Like, why are we not feeling whole internally? And why can't we find that wholeness and that happiness and that bliss just within ourselves when we're sitting alone? So all of these areas I'm really fascinated with, and the more I research them, the more I kind of want to give them back and talk about them more. That's why I'm getting all these deeply fascinating people on this podcast, the psychologists, people with anecdotal experiences, all these people that are finding happiness and meaning and purpose and connection in their own funny little ways, and we can all learn from that, So that's kind of what I hope to bring to MindMate Counselling. And for you, if you are keen for a chat and you do want to engage me in the counselling process, I'd be all too happy to help. Even if you don't want to and you just want to keep listening along, we're all a bunch of mind mates here. We're all a bunch of mates. So it's about growing this as well. Guys, Like I said in the beginning, before that huge hectic rant, this episode is a shorter episode, and it's a blog I wrote, and it's called The Dalai Lama and Ronnie Coleman Ain't So Different After All. So let me read it for you. It's just a stream of consciousness. It's maybe a different way of thinking about happiness, as something a little bit more logical and something that you can actually kind of work towards being happier if you think of it like this way. So it's an exploration of ideas. Here we go. So, this is an excerpt from chapter 2 of my upcoming book, A Seeker's Path. I recently followed the Dalai Lama on Instagram, 100% get around the big man if you haven't already, and couldn't help but write about him. He seems so bloody jolly, and as the saying goes, I'll have what he's having, or she's having. I came to realize that what he's having took a long time for him to get, and this is my take on mental health practice. To be mentally healthy, one must train just as hard, if not harder, than those looking to improve their physical health. We tend to disregard mental health as a training program and view it more as a permanent state of being. If you're mentally healthy, you're good to go. If you're all over the place, then there's something wrong with you. We know, however, that mental health isn't like thing 1 and thing 2 from the Cat in the Hat. It's not that simple, but the ramifications from playing this simple identity game are dire. Not only for ourselves, but for those around us in our wider community given the modern reach. Imagine if we had physically healthy people and physically unhealthy people, and that was that. Health is a spectrum, and we all rest upon it somewhere along the line. Although we cannot change our genes and the hereditary factors that influence our biological health, we can control what we eat and how often we exercise, not to mention the type of exercise we undertake. Mental health is the same. We look at bodybuilders and Olympic athletes, the greatest contemporary sportsmen and women, and admire them for their unwavering discipline. But when we look at the Buddhists, or those who follow a strict mental health plan, not to discount our secular friends, we write them off, simply as happy people. They were always like that. We see Ronnie Coleman on stage, the greatest bodybuilder of the modern era, and admire him for his work ethic. This is because the results of his work ethic are tangible. You don't get a body like that bloke without grinding hours in the gym every day. Conversely, we see the Dalai Lama smile, laugh, and embrace others equally and think he's always been like that. The Dalai Lama tells us that, quote, happiness is not something ready-made. It comes from your own actions. He tells us to, quote, be kind whenever possible, and that, quote, sometimes not getting what you want is a wonderful stroke of luck. Excuse me, Mr. Lama, what about jet skis, fancy dinners, and Instagram likes? Both Ronnie Coleman and the Dalai Lama have one thing in common: discipline. Judging by standard Buddhist practice, the path to enlightenment, freedom from suffering, is not an easy trod. Waking up at dawn every morning, meditating for hours, removing all sense of individuality, i.e. shaving one's hair, wearing the same red robe every day, abstaining from sex, worldly pleasures, and committing to the spiritual path are all examples, at least in my books, of seriously rigorous mental health practices. Unfortunately, human beings are not entitled either to perfect mental or physical health, which begs the question, how mentally and or physically healthy do we want to be? How many hours are we willing to put into achieving states of consciousness akin to Buddhist monks, for example? What are our physical health goals? Are we willing to devote hours of practice to improve our flexibility, strength, speed, stamina, and joint health? For how long must we meditate every day, write in our diaries, authentically connect with others, and work to release our traumas from the past in order to attain a mental state congruent with our own definition of happiness? Ultimately, this is for us to decide. Maybe people become monks because they're in really bad ways. How else can one know happiness like that without having experienced terrible psychological pain? In any case, just as a bench press pumps the chest, meditation pumps the mind. Choose your tools, seek, and you will find. I didn't even realize that I just rhymed in the end there, so that was awesome. But yeah, that was kind of an exploration of an idea here, guys. I was looking at the Dalai Lama, and, obviously Instagram only kind of gives you one side of, aspect. I'm not saying that, Dalai Lama is just a facade, but he's a human being, and he just seems to be happy and jolly all the time. And I kind of compared that, as you now know, to Ronnie Coleman, who always seems to be in fantastic, physical health. But we know what goes on behind closed doors. We've seen the YouTube videos, if you're in the industry, you watch Ronnie Coleman training and training and training, and you see how his back's fucked now and all these sorts of things. But it's not as tangible when you see someone, or it's not as cool, I guess, when you see someone just sitting and meditating and trying to, work through their thoughts and become happier by themselves, and, all of that stuff that the Dalai Lama, as a Buddhist, and by definition, because the Buddhist practice involves hours and hours of meditation and silence and reflection, you don't see that. So I guess what I would like you to get from this episode of the podcast and this blog, and you can read it up on my Medium account. It's just Tom Ahern on Medium. But maybe, kind of an idea that I'm going for here is that it takes just as much, if not more, to get to those, long stains of happiness, those long kind of states of happiness. And you have to ask yourself what you're willing to put in order to achieve that. If you're really flat in life, you're really, really down in life, you're going to have to audit yourself. You're going to have to look, right, okay, is it because of my past? Are there things in my past that I've not reconciled with? Is it my job? Is it superficial things? What am I not doing? Is it my diet? This holistic approach to finding happiness, meaning, and purpose, all that sort of stuff, you really can reflect and audit and be like, okay, look, I've got to change a few things here, The Dalai Lama, he spends hours and hours and hours looking at his life like that. That's kind of how I see meditation. It's reflection, and look at the result. He seems like a real happy dude. So I think it's achievable for all of us, but I also think we have to put in the practice. And if you want a body like Ronnie Coleman, or you want a mind like the Dalai Lama, we're going to have to get to it. Guys, I really hope you enjoyed this very short episode of the podcast. Like I said in the beginning, I have now officially begun MindMate Counseling. I'm loving working with people. It's really, really exciting for me. It's only in its infancy, and I'm working alongside a lot of the very, very high-end psychologists that I've actually had the privilege of talking to on this show. By the time this episode comes out, you would have already listened to the episode I did with Michael Burge, who is an Order of Australia. He's got an Order of Australia medal. He's spent a lot of his psychological education looking into PTSD, complex trauma. He's worked with Vietnam veterans, and the way he talks about trauma is a very, very, very simple to understand, but awesome at the same time, type way of talking about it. So I love it. And I'm very excited to be kind of working with these as my supervisor and helping them, as they help me. And so it's very exciting. And I really hope you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, guys. Love you all. Peace.